In 1860, after many years of hard-fought tension between the North and South of the United States, the Civil War finally broke out. After the election of Abraham Lincoln and many years of tension between the North and South about slavery, many states decided to secede. These states included Florida, Georgia, and even Texas. Once the Civil War broke out, many free black men rushed in to volunteer for service with the Union. But even though they had fought in the American Revolution and in the War of 1812, African Americans were not permitted to enlist in the army because of a 1792 law that barred them from bearing arms in the U.S. Army. After many African Americans were denied the entry into the U.S. Army, abolitionist Frederick Douglass fought for the rights of these men. Frederick Douglass argued that the inclusion of African Americans in the Union Army would help the North win the war and would be a huge step in the fight for equal rights. Douglass even went on to say, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket." The idea of allowing African Americans to fight for the Union in the war worried Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln worried that allowing the inclusion of these men could prompt the secession of border states such as Missouri and Kentucky. If such a thing happened, this would make it almost impossible for the Union to win this war. But in mid-1862, with the declining number of white volunteers and the amount of deaths for the Union and the need of men, Abraham Lincoln and his men started to rethink the idea. As a result of the reconsideration, on July 17, 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation and Militia Act. This act freed all slaves whose masters were in the Confederate Army and allowed the President to employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary and proper for the suppression of the rebellion. After General Lee's first invasion of Antietam was fought back by the Union Army, on January 1, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation stated, "All persons held as slaves within any state in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward and forever free." And it also stated, "Such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States." At first, recruitment of African Americans into the Army was very slow, but once African American leaders like Frederick Douglass encouraged them to join because it could eventually lead for their full citizenship, many joined, including two of Frederick Douglass's own sons. And in May of 1863, the government even established the Bureau of Colored Troops to manage the number of black soldiers joining the Army. A large group of African American soldiers joining were the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. The group was made of more than 1,000 men. One quarter of them was not even from Massachusetts. They were from slave states, and some even came from Canada and the Caribbean. Then Governor of Massachusetts John A. Andrews chose a young white officer named Robert Gould Shaw to lead these men into battle. On July 18, 1863, the Massachusetts Regiment stormed and even led the Union troops to Fort Wagner. Even though the 600 men of the 54th Regiment were outgunned and outnumbered, this was the first time in the Civil War that black troops led an attack. But even though these African American troops were fighting the same battle as other white men in the Union Army, they were fighting an injustice with equal pay. Initially, black soldiers were paid $10 a week with a reduction of $3 for clothing costs, while white men were paid $13 a week without any type of reduction. Once Congress and the rest of America saw how hard these African Americans were fighting along with the white men of the Union, In June of 1864, Congress granted an equal pay to the U.S. colored troops. Now it was fair for these men to fight along with the Union. Even though African Americans were mainly involved in the Union Army, in a small way they were still involved with the Confederate Army. In many cases, African Americans were brought along with their masters to the war, and by mid-1863, more Confederate soldiers were being killed. There was a quick consideration of bringing African American slaves into the Confederate Army, but President Jefferson Davis quickly ordered for that idea to be suppressed. On March 13, 1865, Confederate legislation finally allowed free black slaves to be enlisted into the Confederate Army, but by this time it was too little too late. Not many volunteered, and it was too late in the war for them to win. In conclusion, the inclusion of African Americans in the Union Army was a huge turning point of the war. Imagine if the Confederacy had allowed their African Americans to join the fight for their freedom. The Confederacy would have had many more troops and they could have even potentially won the war. But we know, because they were so late to the inclusion of African Americans, they eventually lost the war. By the end of the war in 1865, about 180,000 black men had served as soldiers in the army, and 40,000 black soldiers had died in the war. This showed their resiliency, and this showed the power of the African American soldier in this war.